The life of Vincent van Gogh is marked by the same bold strokes and vivid colours that mark his paintings. From the dark years in his native Holland to the sunlight of Provence in his final months in Auvers, the artist's struggle encompasses love affairs with prostitutes, family scandals, romantic obsessions, and mental breakdowns. Yet his intensely moving paintings reveal a man far from mad, who created a new way of seeing the world.
Though I'm often in the depths of misery, there's still calmness, pure harmony and music inside me. I see paintings or drawings in the poorest cottages in the dirtiest corners. I want to paint men and women with a touch of the eternal, whose symbol was once the halo, which we tried to convey by the very radiance and vibrancy of our coloring. I want to get to the point where people say of my work, that man feels deeply, that man feels keenly. I don't think I'm raising my sights too high. I want to do drawings that will touch some people. Vincent van Gogh.
Touch some people indeed. At the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., over a century later, hundreds of thousands endured bitter cold to be touched by Van Gogh's work in an exhibition of 70 paintings on loan from the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam.
It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to come see so many Van Gogh paintings at one time.
Van Gogh is just out of this world. He's my favorite artist. I'm no art critic, but it's fabulous.
It seemed like the only opportunity I'd ever get. We had to see it.
Van Gogh never enjoyed this phenomenal popularity. His paintings did not sell, and he wrote of his lifelong struggle in hundreds of letters to his brother Theo. Fortunately, Theo's family preserved both his letters and his paintings to tell his story.
Today at the Van Gogh Museum, we look after the world's largest collection of his works, with over 200 of his paintings and some 500 of his drawings. We set up our museum just 25 years ago, and when it first opened we thought there would be about 100,000 visitors. Last year we had over 1 million, and so the need for a renovation and a refurbishment of the building was really long overdue. And that's why, closing the museum, we had the opportunity to send an exhibition to the United States.
The possibility of showing the early work, the middle work, and the late work, right up to the very last, was, of course, an opportunity that we really wanted to take the most advantage of we could.
The eldest of 6, Vincent grew up under the strict eye of his father, a Calvinist minister. He left school at 16 and moved through a series of jobs, as an art dealer in London and Paris, and as a teacher at a boys' school in England, where his interest in God grew into an obsession. Always sketching, he returned to Holland to study theology. He was soon on the move again, this time as a missionary to the Borinage, a Belgian mining district.
I want to be bound to Christ with unbreakable bonds, to live in and for Christ, to be one of the poor in his kingdom, steeped in the leaven, filled with his spirit.
Early on, one of his careers was as an evangelical preacher in the Borinage mining district in Belgium, which is a very, very poor area. And we know that he very much identified with his miners, and he went barefoot and lived in poverty. And in fact, it was for that reason that he was fired by his superiors. They felt he was identifying too closely with the people he was supposed to be converting.
One of the reasons why I have no regular job and why I haven't had a regular job for years is quite simply that my ideas differ from those of the gentlemen who hand out jobs.
Disillusioned, rejected by the church itself, Vincent finally found his true vocation. He shifted his boundless, obsessive energy to the creation of art. He was 27.
Dear Theo, I shall set to work again with my pencil, and I shall draw again. I've had the feeling that everything has changed for me, and now I'm in my stride, and my pencil has become slightly more willing and seems to be getting more so by the day.
Theo had followed in his brother's earliest footsteps and was now finding success as an art dealer in Paris. Throughout Vincent's life, he was a source of encouragement, and more importantly, of financial support.
I'm sure you have saved my life, and I shall never forget that. I shall always owe you an infinite debt of loyalty because you held out your hand to me. Money can be repaid, not kindness such as yours.
In 1881, Vincent returned to his parents' home, where he continued to hone his skills, painting familiar scenes of everyday life. However, he became obsessed with a recently widowed cousin. Refusing to accept her rejection, he scandalized the community and created a painful rift in the family.
I sense what father and mother instinctively, I don't say intelligently, think about me. They shrink from taking me into the house as they might from taking in a large shaggy dog who is sure to come into the room with wet paws. In short, he's a filthy beast. Very well, but the beast has a human history.
Van Gogh did really nothing by halves. He was not someone who could stand back and just let things go. So whether it was when he was a teacher or whether he was when he was working as an evangelist with the miners in Belgium, he tackled everything with this enormous conviction, enormous commitment, and so that carries through to when he's an artist. The intensity of his work comes through at all levels.
Vincent left home and settled in The Hague, where he found a mentor in his cousin Anton Mauve, a leading figure among Dutch painters. Mauve offered practical advice, financial assistance, and much-needed encouragement. It was during this period that Vincent began to work seriously in oils.
This week I did a painting that I think would remind you a little of Scheveningen as we saw it when we walked there together. A large study of sand, sea and sky. A big sky of delicate grey and warm white, with a single small patch of soft blue shimmering through. The sand and the sea light, so that the whole becomes golden, but animated by the boldly and distinctively colored small figures and fishing smacks, which tend to set the tonal values.
The early beach scene comes straight out of Dutch landscape or seascape tradition. The color palette, the darkness, the storminess of it is somewhat traditional, but they're all his images. He's looking at fishermen, not farming peasants, but it's the same effective strata of society that interested him. The thing I find interesting about that early scene is just the energy of the paint.
The dialogue with nature was so important. He actually stood on the beach during the storm and painted as much as he could. And the sand, in fact, was blowing up onto the canvas and sticking onto the wet paint. But it's rather, this perseverance is absolutely typical of Van Gogh.
Already estranged from his family, Vincent isolated himself even further. He challenged not only the righteousness of his Calvinist father, but the more liberal sensibilities of his own friends.
I've seen through present-day Christianity only too well. That icy coldness mesmerized even me in my youth. But I've taken revenge since then. How? By worshipping the love which they, the theologians, call sin, by respecting a whole.
Family and friends, including his mentor, Anton Mauve, turned against him when he welcomed Sienne Hornick and her child into his life.
Last winter I met a pregnant woman deserted by the man whose child she was carrying. I took that woman on as a model and have worked with her all winter. I couldn't pay a model's full daily wages, but I paid her rent all the same, and thus far, thank God, I've been able to save her and her child from hunger and cold by sharing my own bread with her. It strikes me that any man worth his salt would have done the same in a case like this.
Life with Sienne became increasingly difficult, especially after the birth of her second child. After 18 months together, Vincent left her, and the financial burden of city life behind. Alone again, he ventured into the bleak Dutch province of Drenthe, seeking a simpler, less expensive way of living.
Imagine a white, muddy road, all black mud, with an infinity to the right and an endless heath to the left. A few black triangular silhouettes of sod-built huts, through the little windows of which shines the red light of the little fire, with a few pools of dirty, yellowish water that reflect the sky.
Even in Drenthe, Vincent's meager finances were not sufficient. He was forced to return home, where his family reluctantly took him in again. He never stopped painting.
One must work on one's technique, simply to express better, more accurately, more profoundly what one feels, and the less verbiage, the better.
In the winter of 1885, Vincent began a series of studies in preparation for a work that he hoped would be shown by the Salon in Paris, a crucial endorsement if he were to sell his work. He was inspired by contemporary writers, especially Émile Zola.
Read Zola's description of women in a room in the twilight. Most of the women aged between 30 to 50. Such a somber, mysterious place. I find it splendid.
That spring, he created his largest canvas to date. It incorporated the skills learned during his years of study and reflected his compassion for the poor.
In a literal sense, it's his masterpiece. That is to say, it's the work which he painted to demonstrate his mastery after a number of years of apprenticeship. So for him, it was an important statement on a grand scale, comparing himself with the great masters of the past.
The point is that I've tried to bring out the idea that these people eating potatoes by the light of their lamp have dug the earth with the self-same hands they are now putting into the dish, and it thus suggests manual labor and a meal honestly earned.
The very use of the paint directly, the blockiness of it, the expressionist quality of it, I think offers a much more direct interpretation of his subjects than a traditional romantic artist would. He didn't see these as romantic figures. He saw them as noble.
If a peasant painting smells of bacon, smoke, potato steam, fine. That's not unhealthy. If a stable reeks of manure, all right, that's what a stable is all about. If a field has the smell of ripe corn or potatoes, that's probably healthy, especially for city dwellers. Such pictures might prove helpful to them.
The painting was never submitted to the Salon. Vincent's father, Pastor Theodorus Van Gogh, died that spring of 1885. Vincent captured his intense emotions in a painting he completed in a single day. His father's Bible, large and heavy, lies beside Vincent's well-thumbed copy of Émile Zola's novel, La Joie de Vivre. The painting, which he dedicated to his father, was a clear statement of their conflicted relationship. Vincent moved on. He left the muddy lanes of his home for the paved streets of Antwerp.
I've walked in many different directions along the dock several times already. The contrast is particularly marked for one who has just arrived from the sand and heath and the tranquility of a country village and has been in a quiet surrounding for a long time. It's all an impenetrable confusion.
Amid the bustle of the city, Vincent compared his work with that of his contemporaries and began to focus on the effects of light.
It's odd that my painted studies look darker here in the city than in the country. Is that because the light isn't as bright in the city? I'm not sure, but it might matter more than one might think at first sight.
He painted live models wherever he could and briefly attended art classes.
This is a painting he did as a painting exercise in the academy in Antwerp. And like medical students with a cadaver, I'm sure someone stuck a cigarette in its mouth, and it was a little student joke.
After only 3 months, Vincent was ready for Paris. In fact, he arrived at Theo's apartment without warning.
Don't be angry with me for arriving out of the blue. I've given it so much thought, and I'm sure we'll gain time this way. In Antwerp, I didn't even know what the Impressionists were. Now I've seen them, and much admired certain Impressionist pictures.
Stimulated by his arrival in Paris, Vincent painted everything from still lifes to architecture, landscapes, and portraiture. Yet even in the urban sophistication of the French capital, he retained his ties to the working man.
The wonderful painting of the shoes is one of his most famous early pictures, and I think it's extraordinary because it's a portrait of a pair of shoes. He manages to take one of the most humble subjects and make it into something as interesting as a portrait. He really expresses the character and wear and, if you like, the history of the shoes. The flying fox is an extraordinary image. It's a study, it's something he must have seen in a taxidermist shop or in a museum. We shouldn't forget that Van Gogh read a lot. He was certainly familiar with Edgar Allan Poe, and there's a kind of a Poe-like mystery about it. So there are many resonances that come from that picture.
Self-portraits rendered between Vincent's arrival in March 1886 and his departure for Provence in February 1888 show the transformation not only of the artist, but of his subject.
We know it was difficult for him to find models. I think he used himself literally as a model in order to try out different styles. But of course there is also a degree of psychic exploration in them. I mean, he clearly was fascinated by how his physiognomy expressed his different states of mind at different stages of his life.
A pinkish-grey face with green eyes, ash-colored hair, wrinkles on the forehead and around the mouth, stiff, wooden. A very red beard, considerably neglected and mournful, but the lips are full. You will say that this resembles the face of death. It isn't an easy job to paint oneself if it is to be different from a photograph.
He's clearly making a formal statement about his standing as an artist. And then go to the others and see how they are much more sketchy and more experimental. There's a little one done in greyish colours. It's very sketchy, where he looks rather hunted or haunted as a person. There's another one done in the rather brown manner of his Dutch works, where he looks rather kind of avuncular and studious. There's another one where he's dressed up. I'm sure he borrowed Theo's suit and grey fedora to dress himself up as a city slicker. My favourite of the group is the one in a straw hat, where he's dressed up as a plein air painter going out into the country. That's a very remarkable picture because if you look at the painting of the eyes, they're painted in red outlines with green shadows, looks forward to Fauvism, extraordinarily advanced. So there's a whole world of different pictures just in those self-portraits.
Vincent plunged headlong into one of the most exciting moments in the history of art. Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and their Impressionist colleagues had introduced a radically new style of painting. Their work was only beginning to be accepted by the public.
He's experimenting with the style of Pissarro, then you see him playing around with Seurat's pointillism. We'd see him looking at Cézanne's still lives. He's really exploring all the different options that a young artist had at this time.
Working in the atelier of Fernand Cormont, Vincent rubbed elbows with the likes of Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, Paul Signac, and of Émile Bernard, who would become his friend and confidant. Bernard wrote of Van Gogh,
I can see him again at Cormont's in the afternoon, when the atelier empty of students became for him a sort of cell. He copies the beautiful forms with angelic patience. He corrects himself, starts over with passion, erases, and finally wears a hole in his sheet of paper from rubbing it with an eraser. Émile Bernard.
He began using a perspective frame, which is a wooden frame about 2 feet high by 3 feet wide, with strings or wires drawn across it to create a kind of grid. You look through the grid and you copy what you see through the grid onto the paper, using the grid as a guidance. If you look very carefully at vegetable gardens in Montmartre, it's quite a thinly painted picture, and underneath the paint layer you can see the grey charcoal lines where he'd sketched out the grid on the canvas. So it's a fascinating work, because if you look carefully you can really see his working process.
He's moving from the darkness of the north, the dark palette, into the French capital, where Impressionism is evolving as a revolutionary movement against the French Academy.
The progress of color is an undeniable fact precisely because of the Impressionists. I painted almost nothing but flowers so as to get used to colors other than gray, such as pink, soft or bright green, light blue, violet, yellow, orange, glorious red. I'm trying to render intense color in color-seeking life. To express the love of two lovers by the marriage of two complementary colors, their blending and their contrast, the mysterious vibrations of related tones.
Vincent absorbed the French landscape. He painted Montmartre with its stone quarry, gardens, and outbuildings. He visited the Île de la Grande Jatte, trying his hand at Impressionism.
In order to write a book, do a deed, make a picture with some life in it, one has to be alive oneself. And so enjoy yourself as much as you can and remember that what people demand in art nowadays is something very much alive, with strong color and intensity. If we study Japanese art, we discover a man who is undeniably wise, philosophical and intelligent, who spends his time doing what? Studying the distance from the Earth to the Moon? No. He studies a single blade of grass. But this blade of grass leads him to draw all the plants, then the seasons, the grand spectacle of landscapes, finally animals, then the human figure.
Japanese art was very voguish in Paris at this time. Many artists and collectors collected Japanese prints, not least Vincent and Theo. In this case, Van Gogh found a magazine called Paris Illustré, and on the cover there was a reproduction of a print of a courtesan from the pleasure quarters. And Van Gogh himself traced the magazine cover, and then he squared up the tracing in order to transfer it to the larger format of the painting. What he's done is to take the idea of the Japanese print and to develop even further the strong colors, the flat areas of color. And in fact, surrounding the image of the courtesan, you will see a number of other images taken from other Japanese prints. A bullfrog in the foreground, some cranes in the background, bamboo canes, rethinking the Japanese print in his own terms.
Yellow is a color for him that he takes to a level that I don't think any other artist did. They talk about Spanish artists using black in a way no one else could. Well, Van Gogh, I think yellow is his color.
He loved the color yellow. The still life with citruses and lemons he did as a gift for his brother Theo. It's inscribed to his brother Theo. And I think it was intended to show Theo how much Vincent had learned in his couple of years living with him and studying with many of the artists who were their mutual friends. It's absolutely an explosion of different shades of yellow, framed, of course, in his own wonderful yellow-painted frame. So in a way he's making a statement, I think, about his assimilation of Impressionism, but also the way he's setting off into a new sunny world in the south, expressed through yellow paint.
After 2 years in Paris, Vincent was eager to escape to the bright sunlight of Provence. In the winter of 1888, he moved to Arles.
Everything has old gold, bronze and copper in it, and this together with the green azure of the white-hot sky imparts a delicious, exceptionally harmonious color.
It obviously had a profound effect on him and on his art, and he began to take the easel out, put it in the landscape, and work, and have these transforming canvases from that period.
The air is definitely doing me good. I wish you could fill your lungs with it. One of its effects on me is quite amusing. A single small glass of cognac here goes to my head, so my constitution is under less strain. I'm using up an enormous amount of canvases and paints, but I hope it's not a waste of money for all that.
In a letter to his friend Émile Bernard, Vincent explained how free his work had become and how it was possible to be so prolific an artist.
I hit the canvas with irregular touches of the brush, which I leave as they are. Patches of thickly laid on color, spots of canvas left uncovered, here and there portions that are left absolutely unfinished, repetitions, savageries. I try to grasp what is essential in the drawing. Later, I fill in the spaces which are bounded by contours, either expressed or not, but in any case, felt, with tones which are also simplified.
To his brother, he was even more effusive.
I'm up to my ears in work, for the trees are in blossom, and I want to paint a Provençal orchard of astounding gaiety.
Vincent travelled a short distance to Les Saintes-Maries de la Mer in June. In a few days, he had painted 3 canvases and filled innumerable pages with sketches.
The Mediterranean has the colors of mackerel. You don't always know if it is green or violet. You can't even say it's blue, because the next moment the changing light has taken on a tinge of pink or grey.
His work had come a long way since Scheveningen Beach in stormy weather.
Now that I've seen the sea here, I'm absolutely convinced of the importance of positively piling it on, exaggerating the color. After a while, one's sight changes. I've made a start in the south. I can hardly conceive of going anywhere else. I'm working on a landscape with wheat fields. It has changed entirely from what it was in the spring, but certainly my love for the countryside, which is already beginning to appear scorched, has grown no less. Perhaps I'm on the right track.
It's just amazing how he weaves these intense tapestries of color with his brushwork. I mean, he really makes the one oil color play off against another to give the paintings a life that's somehow different from nature. You're seeing it, if you like, filtered through his temperament.
In Arles, Vincent also found a wealth of new faces, ordinary people who, as always, he was eager to paint. He befriended a soldier who posed for several portraits.
I have a model at last. The half-length I did of him was horribly harsh. That bronzed feline head of his with a reddish cap against a green door and the orange bricks of a wall. So it's a savage combination of incongruous tones, not easy to manage. I learned from it, which is what I want most for my work.
For Vincent, Provence was more than a place to pursue his solitary ambition. He dreamed of starting an artist's colony with Paul Gauguin.
Well, Gauguin had rather successfully founded a community of artists in Pont-Aven in Brittany. And Van Gogh, I think, to some extent imitating him, wanted to found a studio of the South, as he called it. He hoped that Gauguin, Émile Bernard, and other artist friends would come down and work with him.
If Gauguin were willing to join me, I think it would be a step forward for us. It would establish us squarely as the explorers of the South, and nobody could complain of that.
As autumn waned and he waited for Gauguin's arrival, Vincent focused his efforts on preparing the building that would house their new brotherhood.
The dome of the sky is a wonderful blue. The sun has rays of a pale sulfur. It's as soft and delightful as the combination of heavenly blues and yellows in Vermeer. I can't paint it as beautifully, but it absorbs me so much that I let myself go without giving thought to a single rule.
The Yellow House turns out to be kind of an extraordinary painting in many ways. The yellow itself, high noon, flat, no shadows. You can almost feel the sun in that. I think it's a wonderful painting that meant a great deal to him as a place.
Yesterday I was busy with the furnishing of the house. My bedroom I want to keep extremely simple, but with large, solid furniture. Bed, chairs, table.
The orange yellow of the bed, the lilac blue of the wall, the pink of the floorboards with the green drawing on them, the yellow chairs. Gauguin was a specialist in applying large flat areas of color, and I think Van Gogh here is to some extent acknowledging Gauguin's influence.
Everything depends on the color, and by simplifying it I'm lending it more style, creating an overall impression of rest or sleep. In fact, a look at the picture ought to rest the mind, or rather the imagination.
Paul Gauguin arrived at last on October the 23rd. Vincent was ecstatic.
Gauguin seems to be in better health than I am. He is very interesting as a man, and I have every confidence that we shall achieve a great deal with him. I must tell you that he knows how to cook perfectly. It's very convenient.
Gauguin also was, at first, optimistic.
In my yellow room, sunflowers with purple eyes stand out on a yellow background. They bathe their stems in a yellow pot on a yellow table. In the morning, upon awakening from my bed, I imagine that all this smells very good. Paul Gauguin.
Van Gogh and Gauguin entered into their work with renewed passion. Gauguin painted Van Gogh at his easel. Vincent painted a series of portraits of his neighbors, the Roulin family. However, it didn't take long for philosophical differences to emerge.
Gauguin and I discussed Delacroix, Rembrandt, and so on a great deal. The debate is exceedingly electric, and sometimes when we finish, our minds are as drained as an electric battery after discharge.
One of the differences between Van Gogh and Gauguin was the fact that Vincent captured the essence of actual landscapes and real people, while Gauguin often painted from memory, even adding mystical elements to the canvas.
Van Gogh is an artist who very much wanted to paint directly from nature. And on the other hand, you had Gauguin saying, no, close your eyes to the natural world and concentrate on what's inside your head. Bring out emotions, bring out ideas, use your colors to do that. Whereas I think that was rather uncomfortable for Van Gogh.
I think that Gauguin was a little disenchanted with the good town of Arles, the little yellow house where we work, and above all, with me.
In fact, Vincent was suffering from sudden, debilitating attacks, his behavior becoming increasingly erratic. On a December night, after another volatile argument, Gauguin stormed out of the Yellow House.
I heard behind me a familiar short footstep, rapid and irregular. I turned just at the moment when Vincent rushed towards me, an open razor in his hand. My look must have been powerful indeed, for he stopped and, lowering his head, took off running in the direction of the house.
Gauguin returned to the Yellow House in the morning, where he was greeted by the sight of Vincent in a blood-soaked bed.
Gently, very gently, I touched the body, whose warmth surely announced life. Almost in a whisper, I said to the Commissioner of Police, "Be so kind, sir, as to awaken this man with great care, and if he asks for me, tell him that I have left for Paris." The sight of me could be fatal to him.
Vincent had sliced away part of his ear and presented it to one of the girls at the local brothel. Alerted by telegram, Theo arrived to find Vincent in the hospital.
There have been very many attempts to diagnose Van Gogh's illness, but perhaps the most important thing is not to concentrate on the illness itself, but on just how lucid he was in the periods in between his attacks. There's no doubt that whatever the exact nature of the illness was, it took the form of periods of hallucination and periods when he just couldn't work or act or do anything. But in between, he was in full command and very eager to make the best use of those times.
My dear friend Gauguin, left behind alone on board my little yellow house, I reproach myself now that it was I who was perhaps the cause of your departure. Unless, of course, that departure was planned beforehand. The imagination of the South makes for friendship, believe me, and the two of us will always be friends.
Vincent soon suffered another attack and was again hospitalized. Disoriented, he returned to the yellow house, only to be confronted by his neighbor's petition to have him locked up. We, the undersigned, have the honor of informing you that the painter has, on several occasions, furnished proof that he is not in full possession of his mental faculties. His instability causes fear for all the residents of the neighborhood, particularly for women and children. Vincent was placed in isolation, but by the end of March he was painting again, spending his days in the orchards that had so entranced him the previous spring. In May, as sporadic attacks continued to frustrate his work, he admitted himself to the asylum at Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. Confined at first to the hospital grounds, Vincent used the rooms, the windows, and his fellow patients of the asylum for his subjects.
I'm working on a portrait of one of the patients here. It's curious that after one has been with them for some time and got used to them, one doesn't think of them as being mad anymore.
Soon he was allowed back out into the fields, under supervision.
The olive trees are very characteristic, and I'm struggling to catch them. They are old silver, sometimes with more blue in them, sometimes greenish, bronzed, fading white above a soil which is yellow, pink, violet tinted or orange, to dull red ochre. Very difficult though, very difficult.
Enjoying the security of Saint-Rémy, Vincent entered one of his most productive periods in the summer of 1889. He experimented freely, painting intimate details, bright sunshine and dense shadow.
The study is all yellow, extremely thickly painted, but the subject was beautiful and simple. For I see in this reaper, a vague figure toiling away for all his worth in the midst of the heat to finish his task, I see in him the image of death, in the sense that humanity might be the wheat he is reaping. But there's no sadness in this death. This one takes place in broad daylight, with the sun flooding everything with a light of pure gold.
Vincent's work was beginning to be shown. Theo's new wife saw one painting at the Paris exhibit of the Independence. She wrote to Vincent, "I sat there for a whole 15 minutes, enjoying the delicious coolness and freshness of the undergrowth. It's as though I knew this spot."
Johanna Van Gogh Bonga, Theo's wife, is a very important figure in all this. You have to remember it was quite a while till she actually met Vincent. To begin with, I think there was some resentment that Theo was sending this money to this weird artistic brother-in-law living in France. And it was really only after Theo's death, I believe, that Johanna began to realize the importance of Van Gogh's oeuvre and the importance of Vincent to Theo. The fact that Vincent sent his paintings to Theo and Theo kept them, that's the origins of the Van Gogh Museum.
Vincent suffered another attack in mid-July.
I had a bad piece of luck this last time during my illness. That lithograph of Delacroix's La Pietà, along with some other sheets, fell into some oil and paint and was ruined. I was very sad about it. So I've been busy painting it, and you will see it one day on a size 5 or 6 canvas.
Attacks occurred again in December, and then in January of 1890.
Oddly enough, I'd been working quite calmly on canvases you will shortly be seeing, when suddenly, without reason, I once again became confused.
The attacks were sometimes accompanied by attempts to eat his paints, and doctors insisted that Vincent work only on sketches. But by the time Joanna gave birth to a baby boy named Vincent, after him, the proud uncle was again able to return to oils.
It's a painting all about spring and new birth, which he then sent to them as a gift, which they liked very much. They hung on their bedroom wall. We're looking at almond blossom from below, radiant blue sky behind. It's an extremely positive image, and we might remember this was done while he was in the asylum at Saint-Rémy.
By the end of January, Vincent's work was attracting notice. Critic Albert Aurier wrote, "Beneath skies that sometimes dazzle, beneath the incessant and formidable streaming of every conceivable effect of light, there is the disquieting and disturbing display of a strange nature that is at once entirely realistic and yet almost supernatural, where everything rears and rises up with a raging will to howl its own essential song." That spring, Vincent battled another series of attacks. He became anxious to travel north to Auvers-sur-Oise, outside Paris, to be closer to Theo's new family.
If I wait, I shall be letting the favorable period of calm between 2 attacks go by. Then, if the illness does come back, we could see if I can continue to be at liberty, or if I must settle down in a lunatic asylum for good.
Vincent left Provence that May, stopping in Paris to meet Joanna and his young nephew for the first time.
The journey and everything else have gone well so far, and coming back north has taken my mind off things a great deal. I found a perfect friend in Dr. Gachet. So alike are we physically and mentally. He's very nervous and most odd himself. He certainly seems as ill and distraught as you or me.
Under Dr. Gachet's care, Vincent immediately began painting the people and places around him.
I'm trying to do some studies, nothing but ears of wheat with green-blue stalks, long leaves like ribbons of green shot with pink, ears that are just turning yellow. I plan to paint some portraits against a very vivid yet tranquil background, which by its vibration will make you think of the gentle rustle of the ears swaying in the breeze.
Auvers was a favorite with artists, and once home to the late painter Charles-François d'Aubigny, whose work Vincent admired.
Dear Theo, perhaps you'll take a look at this sketch of d'Aubigny's garden. It's one of my most carefully thought out canvases.
Vincent was increasingly worried about remaining dependent on Theo, who now had a family to support. Visits to and from Paris did little to ease his mind.
I was afraid that my being a burden to you was something you found intolerable, but you do realize that I'm working and making an effort just as much as you are, although the brush is nearly falling from my hands.
Van Gogh was indeed plumbing new depths, combining the bright palette of Provence with the darker shadows of his earlier work.
I've painted 3 more large canvases. There are vast stretches of wheat under troubled skies, and I didn't have to put myself out very much in order to try and express sadness and extreme loneliness. I try to be reasonably good-humored in general, but my life is also under attack at its very root.
Adeline Ravoux, the innkeeper's daughter, would never forget the night of July the 27th, 1890, when Vincent returned from the fields.
It must have been about 9 o'clock. He was walking, bent over, holding his stomach. Mother asked him, "Monsieur Vincent, we were worried. Did you run into some trouble?" He answered in a suffering voice, "No, but I..." He did not finish, but climbed the staircase to his room. Father went upstairs, where he found Vincent lying on his bed, curled up, his knees by his chin. Vincent showed him a small wound in the area of his heart. Father exclaimed, "You poor man, what did you do?" "I wanted to kill myself," answered Van Gogh. Theo arrived by train in the middle of the afternoon. I remember seeing him arrive running. He immediately went up to his brother, whom he embraced while speaking to him in their native language. After the emotion he experienced upon seeing his brother, Vincent fell into a coma. Theo and my father watched over the wounded man until his death, which occurred at 1 o'clock in the morning.
Vincent's last letter to Theo was still in his pocket.
The truth is, we can only make our pictures speak. But yet, my dear brother, I shall always consider you to be something more than a simple dealer. That through my mediation, you have your part in the actual production of some canvases, which will retain their calm even in the catastrophe. My own work, I'm risking my life for it, and my reason has half foundered because of it. That's all right.
The funeral was held on July the 30th, 1890. Sunflowers were placed on the casket. Vincent's palette and brushes lay at the foot. Émile Bernard wrote the eulogy.
Let us exult before his biblical harvests at twilight, where sheaves heavily laden with spikes stack into mountains, where blades undulate like golden banners. Let us dream under these beds of flowers that twinkle like fallen stars on the peaceful banks of this river that flows without a ripple at the foot of the suffering hills. And after these successive emotions, let us read in the eyes of his portraits the confessions of those existences, sad or shameful, good or evil. Then we will begin to understand Vincent and to admire him.
I can visualize the vague possibility of one day doing paintings with some joy and freshness in them, even though my own youth is one of the things I've lost. And the doctrine I preach? My friends, let us give our souls to the cause. Let us work with our heart and truly love what we love. Vincent van Gogh.